Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are unpacking the absolutely staggering historical footprint of Paul the Missionary. Now, we're skipping the basic Sunday school overviews today. Instead, we're going to look strictly at the hard data, the grueling geography, and the primary texts. We really want to see exactly how this one individual sparked a movement that permanently rewired the cultural and religious fabric of the ancient world.
33. Just let that sink in for a second. That number represents the immense, unrelenting scale of years Paul dedicated to his global mission. Remember, this was an era where travel meant facing catastrophic shipwrecks, actual bandits, and the brutal elements of the Mediterranean, with zero modern safety nets. To do that for 3 years is tough. To do it for over 3 decades, that is an absolute historical marvel. We're talking about a lifetime of walking, sailing, and enduring unimaginable hardships to systematically deliver his message across an empire.
So, to synthesize this massive amount of historical data into a clean, logical story, we'll break it down into 4 key areas. First, defining the missionary. Second, we'll map out that 30-year global mission. Third, we'll look at the faces of the faithful. And finally, his martyrdom and enduring legacy. All right, let's dive right in. Starting with Section 1, defining the missionary. You know, to truly grasp how Paul survived all those years on the road, we really have to look at the specific Greek terms he used to define his own identity. His linguistic choices tell us exactly how he viewed the weight of his calling.
The biggest one, for sure, is apostolos, which he uses 19 different times in his letters. But here's what's fascinating. In older classical Greek usage, this wasn't just a simple word for a messenger. It was actually a deeply ingrained seafaring and military term. It described an admiral leading a naval fleet. It means someone dispatched with the absolute, full backing and authority of the state. Paul didn't see himself as just a casual traveler with a neat opinion. He saw himself as a commissioned representative, acting directly on behalf of the ultimate sender, with full authority to establish outposts of a new kingdom. Then we have the term doulos, meaning a slave who belongs completely to a master and lives entirely under his authority. And here we hit a really wild cultural paradox. Paul was highly educated, right? He held coveted Roman citizenship. Yet he deliberately chose to adopt the title of the absolute lowest rung of ancient society. Why? Well, in the first century, a slave's status was directly determined by the status of their master. So by declaring his absolute subjugation to Christ, he wasn't being reluctant. He was claiming this total submission as a profound privilege that actually superseded any worldly rank.
Another critical word he throws into the mix is presbyuo. Imagine the inherent danger of acting as a top-level diplomatic envoy in the ancient world, an ambassador carrying terms of peace straight into potentially hostile territory. Paul saw himself in precisely this perilous role, an authorized representative actively carrying a treaty across dangerous borders, communicating this vital, urgent message of reconciliation between the divine and humanity.
Honestly, the sheer variety of hats he wore to get this mission done is staggering. He functioned as a diakonos, or minister, and a synergos, literally a fellow worker directly alongside God. Publicly, he was a kerix, acting as a herald in the town squares, and a didaskalos, shaping early theology. Behind the scenes, he was a letogos and hierogio, doing the sacred work meant to bridge the gap for non-Jewish converts. And maybe the most administratively taxing, he was an oikonomos, a steward managing the profound mysteries of his faith. Together, these aren't just words for a preacher. They paint this composite picture of a heavily burdened administrator, pioneer, and spiritual diplomat systematically building a continental network.
All right, Section 2, a 30-year global mission. Having established his mindset, let's shift our focus to the physical, geographical reality of his travels across the Mediterranean. To put this into perspective, consider the historical baseline. Jesus' own public ministry lasted approximately 3 years. Paul's endurance stretched that model tenfold, running from his initial conversion around AD 33 or 34, all the way to his probable execution under Emperor Nero around AD 64 to 67. We are looking at an unyielding 30-plus years. The level of physical and psychological resilience that requires just defies typical human limits.
Let's trace the physical toll of those years across just the first block of his 16 geographical phases. The mileage alone is breathtaking. He moves from his initial transformative experience in Damascus, retreats into Arabia, heads down to Jerusalem, and then spends a solid, quiet decade building a foundation in Cilicia and Syria. By AD 42, he arrives at Antioch, which becomes his major launchpad, and from there, the explosion outward begins. Remember, we aren't talking about paved modern highways.
We're talking about navigating treacherous mountain passes like the Taurus Range into southern Galatia, risking coastal fevers in Pamphylia, and surviving perilous sea crossings to finally bring his movement onto European soil in Macedonia by AD 50. Every single phase here represents extreme physical exhaustion and logistical brilliance.
And the momentum, it only accelerates as he enters his later years. He pushes further into Achaia, setting up shop for 18 months in the bustling hub of Corinth. He relocates to Ephesus in Asia Minor for a massive multi-year campaign that actually shook the local economy. He sweeps all the way up toward Illyricum, which is the modern-day Balkans, faces arrest and years of imprisonment in Judea, and eventually arrives in the imperial capital of Rome as a prisoner by AD 60. But the surviving historical evidence indicates his journey didn't even end in chains there. Records suggest he was released, pushing his mission past the capital to reach the absolute limits of the West in Spain around AD 63, before doubling back to organize final communities in Crete. I mean, it's a logistical itinerary that would exhaust anyone today, let alone an ancient traveler going by foot and sail.
Moving to Section 3, Faces of the Faithful, because beyond the massive geography and the sweeping timelines, we can't forget this was entirely a grassroots movement built on individual, radical human lives. The socioeconomic diversity of the people Paul connected with was historically stunning. In a Roman society obsessed with rigid class boundaries, look at what's happening here. You have Sergius Paulus, a high-ranking Roman proconsul, sharing a foundational belief system with Onesimus, a runaway slave. You have Lydia, a wealthy, prominent businesswoman in Philippi, alongside a local working-class jailer. You have Crispus, a deeply entrenched synagogue ruler, right alongside the very first pagan converts in Achaia. Paul possessed this rare communicative elasticity that allowed him to seamlessly breach basically every societal, economic, and religious boundary of the ancient world. And his impact extended way beyond one-on-one interactions. Paul acted as the catalyst for massive, diverse crowds who fundamentally altered the trajectory of their own cities. Take Ephesus. His multi-year stay there was so culturally disruptive that large crowds publicly burned their incredibly expensive magical scrolls, entirely transforming the local economy. In intellectual centers like Athens, he successfully debated prominent thinkers like Dionysius and Damaris, proving his philosophy could hold its own in the shadow of the Parthenon. He was literally sparking localized revolutions of thought everywhere he went. So, looking at all of this incredible, relentless momentum, the thousands of miles walked, the dozens of churches planted, the societal strata breached, it begs the question, how did a 33-year mission finally come to an end? Which brings us to our fourth and final section, Martyrdom and Enduring Legacy. Let's impartially examine the surviving texts left behind by the early church fathers regarding Paul's final days under the infamous Roman Emperor Nero. We'll begin with Clement of Rome. Now, as an early apostolic father writing near the end of the 1st century, he lends immense credibility here. He writes, "Through jealousy and strife, Paul showed the way to the prize of endurance. 7 times he was in bonds. When he had reached the limits of the West, he gave his testimony before the rulers, and thus passed from the world." Notice how Clement highlights Paul precisely as this paramount historical example of endurance. He cements the legacy of a man who literally pushed his message to the absolute geographic limits of the East and the West before taking his final exit. We get a more visceral historical detail from the Acts of Paul. It reads, "And when Caesar heard that, he commanded all the prisoners to be burned with fire, but Paul to be beheaded after the law of the Romans." This text, along with other early traditions, records a deeply solemn moment right before the execution. Paul supposedly stood, faced east in prayer for a long time, and then stretched forth his neck in silence, offering a moment of profound dignity before the executioner struck. And this brutal end in Rome is dynamically corroborated across a remarkably aligned set of independent historical sources. The early theologian Tertullian writes, "How happy is its church, on which apostles poured forth all their doctrine along with their blood. Paul wins his crown in a death like John's," referencing death by the sword. Across the writings of Tertullian, Dionysius of Corinth, and the historian Eusebius, the ancient records all independently agree on the specifics of this Neronian persecution. While his contemporary, Peter, suffered crucifixion, Paul's Roman citizenship guaranteed his final end would be by beheading. So what does this 33-year legacy of unyielding endurance mean for how we view historical dedication today? Whether you view it through a lens of theology or just pure historical curiosity, his capacity to endure extreme physical hardship, travel across a hostile ancient world, and fundamentally reshape human thought across an entire empire remains genuinely staggering. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Until next time, keep exploring the rich data and the deeply human histories that continue to shape our world.